What happened in between was after Hamdi and Rasul, the government set up what they called combatant status review tribunals. Everybody at Guantanamo got heard by a combatant status review tribunal, and almost everybody was told, yes, you're an enemy combatant, you should stay. There's a wonderful analysis of all the combatant status review tribunals transcript done by Professor Mark Denbo of Seton Hall. So if you look at the Seton Hall website, you can see his analysis, and I'll have to tell you, he's not very complimentary. So after all these combatant status review tribunals, again, we're winnowing. The only people left at Guantanamo are the people the administration is sure that they want to say these really are enemies. Well, after 2008, when the Supreme Court in Boumediene says the people at Guantanamo, which is a United States-run jurisdiction, should have the right to come into federal court and bring a habeas corpus petition, the federal courts in the District of Columbia started hearing these cases. And I haven't looked in the last few weeks, but by my count, the habeas corpus cases that they were hearing, and maybe we can talk later, they have a kind of reduced procedure. Government only has to show a preponderance of the evidence. They will admit hearsay. But even under those rules, the judges, federal judges looking at these cases, held in 2/3 of the habeas cases that they were getting that the government did not have enough credible evidence to hold on to people, not enough evidence that they were enemy combatants. So now I want to tell you about one of those cases, Muhammad Jawad. Jawad was arrested when, he doesn't really know how old he is, but he was probably about 16. Everyone agrees he was certainly under 18 when he was arrested. He had been in a Pakistani refugee camp, and he was conscripted by the Afghanis, by the Taliban, to come, and he was forcibly recruited to come and go with them to Afghanistan. So he was somehow allied with the Taliban. In December of 2002, he was captured in Afghanistan, and he was questioned by Afghani authorities. Now, questioned is a mild word for what happened to him. If you read the account of what they did to him, they tortured him. You did no other word for it. In addition to physical abuse, they told this kid, this teenager, that they were going to kill his family unless he admitted that he had thrown a grenade at American troops. So finally, after who knows how many hours of this really terrible questioning, he ended up signing a confession. What he did was he affixed his thumbprint to a document that he couldn't read. It was in a language that he didn't even know, admitting that he had in fact thrown a grenade at American troops. Well, so then the Bush administration decided that because this was one of the worst, he was one of their poster people for this is who we're going to bring a military commission against. He killed American troops. So they do that. They start a military commission. The prosecutor in the military commission was Lieutenant Colonel Darrell Vandeveld. Colonel Vandeveld looked at the evidence, and he decided that after looking at the evidence, that the only real concrete evidence against Jawad was this confession, which was really unreliable. Colonel Vandeveld said, there's no credible evidence here. And it ended up, he decided to resign his post rather than prosecuting this case. He just thought there was really not sufficient evidence. The military judge in that proceeding then ruled that Jawad's confession, the thumbprint, should not be admissible because it was so unreliable, and also ruled that throwing a grenade at American troops was not a war crime. If we're at war, that's what you do in a war. You throw grenades at American troops. Could we have prosecuted Jawad in a criminal prosecution for throwing grenades at an American and trying to kill them? Sure. But if it's a war, then he was allowed to do that. That's what he's allowed to do in a war. So what ended up happening with Jawad was he did not have a military commission. He was somebody who couldn't really go ahead because there wasn't enough evidence. What ended up happening was he brought a habeas corpus petition in the District of Columbia. After the Obama administration had taken over, there was still a lot of doubt about whether the Obama administration was going to be willing to argue that the confession, his thumbprint, could be admitted against him. And ultimately, the judge just ended up ruling that Jawad just had to be released. So in August of 2009, he was released because the district judge ruled that there simply was not enough credible evidence to justify holding on to him. Lieutenant Colonel Vandeveld said that he said 6 years is long enough for a boy of 16 to serve in virtual solitary confinement in a distant land for reasons he may never fully understand. So Jawad did get to go home to Afghanistan after about 6.5 years in Guantanamo. He kept saying while he was there, I don't understand why I'm here. His mental health deteriorated to the point where people passing by saw him talking to the posters on the wall. He tried to commit suicide by repeatedly banging his head against the wall of his cell. So there are other stories like this too, where district judges have held, and the military people in Guantanamo have held, that there are people there by mistake. So what I want to impress upon you is two things really. The question here is not what rights do terrorists have. The question is, how do we treat people who we suspect of being terrorists? And even without getting to international law or the Constitution, to me, the golden rule answers this. Where were you in December of 2002? What if you had had 6 years, the last 6 years of your life, taken away from you? Just everything that you were doing in a college, family, job, whatever you were doing, if that had happened to you. So I think that the argument that we should be giving fair process to detainees, I think is something that everybody should agree about. And I think that the only real question for discussion and debate should be, what do we mean by fair process?
Thank you, Professor Herman. We'll move on to the questions now.
Sure.
The first question is, how should terrorism suspects captured by the United States be classified for purposes of prosecution and the administration of justice? Are they prisoners of war? Are they combatants? Are they civilians? Or are they something else entirely? And Professor Herman, we'll start with you.
Well, okay, thanks, Andrew. I think I've addressed some of that because it seems to me it depends, first of all, where you've captured somebody. Because if you've captured somebody on the battlefield in Afghanistan, it is permissible to detain that person for the duration of the hostilities. Therefore, detention is permissible, and that's what Hamdi says. On the other hand, the people who are captured, like Mr. Abdul Muttalib, who was captured at the Detroit airport, people who may or may not be terrorists, it seemed to me the war metaphor doesn't help at all in those cases, and that those cases should simply be prosecuted under the criminal system as we prosecute everybody else. The foundation of our legal system, what we do in criminal cases, is William Blackstone, who once rather famously said that the reason we have the proof beyond a reasonable doubt standard is that we should be willing to let 10 guilty people go free to avoid convicting one innocent. Now, I think that's a rather startling idea when you think about people in Guantanamo. But if you look at the numbers, there's also been a study recently done about the releasees from Guantanamo, and there have been several different studies trying to figure out, after these hundreds of people have been released, were they dangerous? Did it turn out that they were going to be re-engaged in terrorism? Well, the numbers are, there's a variation depending on how you define terrorism in the studies, right? But the high percentage, the 85% of the people who have been released, everyone agrees had nothing to do with terrorism after they were released. There's some group that maybe they donated money to Muslim charities that were supporting whatever. And then there's a small number, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people who in fact did re-engage with terrorism after they were released from Guantanamo. That means that we're standing Blackstone on his head. We're saying that it's all right to lock up 9 guilty people, all right to lock up 9 innocent people to avoid releasing one person who might be a terrorist. To me, just turning around, you can't prove innocence. Mohammed Jawad could not prove that he was innocent. It took a long time to free him. So it seems to me, I think the war metaphor has been extremely misleading, and I think our presumption should be to go with the tried and true method that we have of dealing with criminals, which is the criminal courts.
Professor Adicott, would you respond?
Yeah, again, it's not a metaphor, and my colleague, is giving anecdotal cases and individual cases, and that's what you do when you say, well, I'm going to give you a sad story about this fellow, we'll get our violins out. I've been to Guantanamo Bay. I'll tell you what happens there every day right now. The detainees throw urine and feces in the faces of our guards every day to try to get one of them to hit him. Have you read about that on the front page of the paper? No, it doesn't sell newspapers. But if one of our guards touched one of those individuals, you would read about that every day in the New York Times, day after day after day, like you did with Abu Ghraib. Abu Ghraib was individual soldiers in their individual capacity, and yet many people say, well, that's evidence that we torture people. No, that's evidence that you have bad apples in the system. We don't have a perfect system. My colleague is pointing out some imperfections. That's true in any endeavor in human life, and it's particularly true in war. The Supreme Court has not said that only folks in Afghanistan qualify as enemy combatants. The authorization for use of military force said that anybody that was responsible for 9/11, nation, organization, or person. So that could be somebody from Yemen. We have people from Yemen. We have people from Sudan. We have people from a lot of different countries that we have killed and detained. It doesn't just mean Afghanistan. This war is a global war. But we're in the learning process because we've never had a war against a non-state actor. So there's going to be some mistakes made, no question about it.